The champagne glass in Carolyn's hand caught the light from the chandelier, refracting tiny rainbows across the dining room. She stood there, radiant in a dress that hugged her too tightly, her lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. 30 years. 30 goddamn years of marriage. And here she was, raising her glass to toast her newfound happiness with him. The room was packed with people. Friends, family, colleagues. All of them frozen in a collective moment of disbelief. My brother, Mark, sat with his mouth slightly open, a forkful of cake forgotten mid-air. My sister-in-law, Linda, had her hand pressed to her chest like she was trying to keep her heart from leaping out. And then there was him, Brad, some kid barely out of college, with a face that looked like it belonged on a skincare ad. He was leaning against the buffet table, smirking like he'd just won the lottery. My wedding ring felt like it was burning into my finger. I twisted it instinctively, a nervous tic I'd picked up over the years. The band was thin now, worn down by decades of wear, just like the vows Carolyn was so casually shattering. She was speaking, her voice honey-sweet, but I couldn't hear her over the roar in my ears. Something about new beginnings and finding joy in unexpected places. The empty chair beside me screamed louder than any words ever could. It was supposed to be her seat, but she'd left it vacant, choosing instead to stand at the center of the room with Brad. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. The table was set for a celebration of us, but the absence of her presence was a gut punch I hadn't seen coming. I wanted to stand up, to scream, to flip the damn table and send the china crashing to the floor. But I stayed seated, my hands gripping the edge of the table, so tightly my knuckles turned white. The room was too warm, the air thick with the cloying scent of roses and the faint tang of spilled wine. My shirt clung to my back, damp with sweat, and I could feel my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. Carolyn's toast ended with a flourish, and the room erupted into polite applause. Polite, like this was some kind of normal, acceptable behavior. My son, Ethan, caught my eye from across the room. He looked pale, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle twitching. He knew. He'd known. The realization hit me like a freight train, and suddenly the room felt even smaller, the walls closing in around me. I stood up, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. The sound was sharp, cutting through the awkward chatter like a knife. Every head turned toward me, but I didn't care. I walked out of the dining room, my feet carrying me through the kitchen and out the back door into the cool night air. The stars were out, bright and indifferent, and I stood there in the darkness, trying to catch my breath. The sound of laughter drifted out from the house, Carolyn's voice rising above the rest. She was happy, genuinely, disgustingly happy. And I was standing outside in the cold, staring at the empty chair she'd left behind, wondering how the hell I'd ended up here. The champagne glass felt heavy in my hand, like it was filled with lead instead of bubbles. Carolyn was still laughing with him across the room, her hand resting on his forearm like it belonged there. I wanted to smash the glass against the wall, but instead, I just stood there, the weight of 30 years pressing down on my chest. That's when Ethan tapped my shoulder. "Dad," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Can we talk?" Outside. His face was pale like he'd seen a ghost. I followed him to the hallway, the laughter and clinking glasses fading behind us. The family photo on the wall caught my eye. Carolyn, Ethan, and me, all smiling like we'd never heard the word divorce. Ethan turned to me, his hands trembling. "Dad," he started, then stopped, like the words were choking him. "I didn't want to tell you tonight, but I can't keep this in anymore. Mom's been taking money from your accounts. For months. I've known for a while, but I didn't know how to tell you. She's not who you think she is." The hallway tilted. I reached out to steady myself against the wall, the wallpaper rough under my fingers. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan pulled out his phone, swiping through screens until he found what he was looking for. He handed it to me, and I stared at the numbers on the screen. Transfers, withdrawals, dates that lined up with Carolyn's work trips. My stomach churned. "I found out by accident," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "I was helping her with her phone, and I saw the notifications. Dad, she's been lying to you. To all of us." I looked back at the party through the open doorway. Carolyn was still there, her head thrown back in laughter, her hand now resting on his shoulder. The woman I'd built a life with, the woman I'd trusted with everything, was a stranger. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked, my voice rising despite my best efforts to keep it steady. Ethan's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't want to hurt you, and I thought maybe she'd stop, that it was just a phase or something. But it's not. She's been planning this, Dad. She's been setting you up." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and dark. I looked at the family photo again, at the smiles that now felt like a cruel joke. My son's face was a mirror of my own, hurt, angry, betrayed. "What are we going to do?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But as I stood there, staring at the photo of the life we used to have, I felt something shift inside me. The weight of 30 years wasn't just pressing down anymore. It was pushing me forward. "We'll figure it out," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "But first, we need to know everything." Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. And as we stood there in the hallway, the sound of the party drifting in like a cruel echo, I realized this wasn't just about Carolyn anymore. This was about survival. And I wasn't going down without a fight. The bedroom smelled faintly of the lavender candle Carolyn always burned before bed, the scent now nauseating. I stood there, the crumpled hotel receipt in my hand, the paper trembling as if it were alive. The numbers on it glared back at me. $1, $200 for a single night at the Ritz-Carlton. A work trip, she'd called it. I'd even packed her suitcase for her, folding her blouses and slipping a note into the pocket. God, I was a fool. She was sitting at her vanity, meticulously applying her lipstick, the kind of deep red that used to make me think of old Hollywood movies. Now it just looked like blood. The mirror caught her smirk before she even turned to face me. "Care to explain this?" I said, my voice low, holding up the receipt like it was evidence in a courtroom. My hand shook, but I didn't care. She glanced at it, then back at me, her lips curling into that infuriating smile. "Oh, that? I told you, Noah. Work trip. Big client. You know how it is." "Bullshit," I snapped, stepping closer. "You weren't working. You were with him. That kid from the gym, the one who's half your age. Don't lie to me, Carolyn. I'm not blind." She stood then, smoothing her skirt with deliberate slowness. Her reflection in the mirror looked like a stranger, someone I'd never met. "And what if I was?" she said, her tone icy. "What are you going to do about it, Noah? You're retired. You've got nothing. And I've got everything." Her words hit like a punch to the gut. I stared at her, the woman I'd shared a bed with for 3 decades, the mother of my child, and all I saw was a predator sizing up its prey. My wallet was empty, she was right about that. She'd seen to it herself, slowly draining our accounts while I was busy being the dutiful husband, the kind who trusted his wife to handle the finances. "You think you're untouchable," I said, my voice cracking. "But you're not. I'm not just going to sit back and let you destroy everything we built." She laughed then, a sharp, mocking sound that cut through the room. "Oh, Noah," she said, stepping closer, her heels clicking against the hardwood. "You're so naive. You think this is about you? It's not. It's about me. And I'm done pretending to be the perfect little wife." I wanted to scream, to throw something, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain she'd caused me. But I didn't. Instead, I just stood there, the receipt still clutched in my hand, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on my chest like a stone. She walked past me, her perfume lingering in the air like a taunt. "Good night, Noah," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Try not to lose sleep over it." The door clicked shut behind her, and I was alone. The room felt colder somehow, the air heavy with the scent of lavender and lies. I looked down at the receipt again, the numbers blurring as my vision swam. She was wrong about one thing, though. I wasn't going to sit back. Not anymore. The study was quiet except for the faint hum of the old clock on the wall, its ticking a steady reminder of time slipping away. I sat in my leather chair, the one Carolyn had bought me for my 50th birthday, back when she still pretended to care. The room smelled faintly of dust and whiskey, a stale combination that seemed to hang in the air like a ghost. My wedding photo sat on the desk, framed in silver that had long since lost its shine. I stared at it, at the 2 people smiling back at me, frozen in a moment that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. Her dress was white, pure and perfect, and her smile was the kind that could light up a room. My hand rested on her waist, and I remembered how warm she felt, how she leaned into me like I was the only thing that mattered. Now, that same hand clenched around a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid barely covering the bottom. I took a sip, the burn barely registering. The study had always been my sanctuary, a place where I could think, plan, or just escape. But now it felt like a tomb, the walls closing in, the bookshelves lined with memories that mocked me. Carolyn had never spent much time in here. She called it your little cave, with that teasing laugh of hers. I used to think it was endearing. Now I wondered if she'd ever really wanted to know me at all. I picked up the photo, tracing the edge of the frame with my thumb. How had we gotten here? How had the woman who once whispered promises of forever in my ear become the same woman who smirked at me, smug and unashamed, as she flaunted her affair in front of our friends, our family? The cruelty of it was almost impressive. She'd taken everything, our vows, our life, our dignity, and turned it into a joke. The whiskey glass caught the light, half empty, just like everything else in my life. I wanted to hate her. I wanted to scream, to break something, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain she'd caused me. But the anger came in waves, crashing over me and then receding, leaving behind a hollow ache. I was tired, so damn tired. I set the photo down, the glass in the frame reflecting my face for a moment. I barely recognized the man staring back at me. The lines on my face were deeper, the gray in my hair more pronounced. I looked like someone who had lost a war, and maybe I had. 30 years of marriage, and what did I have to show for it? A dusty study, a half-empty glass, and a heart that felt like it had been hollowed out. The clock kept ticking, the sound echoing in the quiet room. I thought about Carolyn out there somewhere, probably laughing with him, that younger man who had so easily slipped into the life I'd built. I wondered if she ever thought about me, if she ever felt even a flicker of guilt. Probably not. She'd always been good at moving on, at rewriting the story to suit her needs. I leaned back in the chair, the leather creaking under my weight. The study felt smaller than ever, the walls pressing in, the air heavy with the weight of everything I couldn't say, couldn't do. I wanted to scream, to break something, to tear the whole damn house down. But instead, I just sat there, staring at that damned photo, wondering how the hell it had all gone so wrong. And then, like a spark in the darkness, a thought flickered to life. Maybe I couldn't change what had happened. Maybe I couldn't undo the damage she'd done. But I could still fight back. I could still reclaim something, even if it was just my pride. I set the whiskey glass down, the clink of it against the desk louder than I expected. The clock kept ticking, but for the first time in weeks, it felt like time was on my side. The bridge club met every Thursday at 10 a.m. sharp, rain or shine. It had been that way for 15 years, long before Carolyn started pulling away, long before she started staying out late, claiming her elderly care clients needed her more than I did. I sat at my usual spot at the table, the one by the window where the sunlight hit just right, warming my back as I shuffled the deck. The cards felt heavier than usual, like they were made of lead instead of paper. My coffee cup sat untouched, the steam curling up and vanishing into the air like the last remnants of my trust in Carolyn. Across the table, Frank was rambling about his golf game, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. I nodded along, my fingers tapping the edge of the deck in a rhythm only I could hear. My mind wasn't on the game. It was on the notebook tucked into the inside pocket of my jacket, the one I'd started filling with dates, amounts, and names. Carolyn thought she was clever, but she'd underestimated me. I wasn't just some retired accountant who spent his days playing cards and sipping coffee. I knew numbers better than I knew my own reflection. Frank slapped down a card, and the sound snapped me back to the present. "Your move, Noah," he said, grinning like he always did when he thought he had the upper hand. I glanced at my hand, the king of hearts staring back at me like a taunt. Carolyn always said I was too predictable, too cautious. Maybe she was right, back then, but not anymore. I played my card, a calculated risk, and watched as Frank's grin faltered. "Good move," he muttered, leaning back in his chair. The others chuckled, but I barely heard them. My mind was already racing ahead, piecing together the fragments of Carolyn's deception. The hotel receipts I'd found tucked in the back of her drawer. The withdrawals from our joint account that didn't add up. The way she'd started wearing perfume again after years of claiming she was allergic. I excused myself from the table, citing a headache, and stepped out onto the porch. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that sharpens your thoughts instead of dulling them. I pulled out the notebook and flipped through the pages, my handwriting neat and precise, just like my columns of numbers. Each entry was a piece of the puzzle, a thread in the web Carolyn had woven around me. But I wasn't trapped anymore. I was the one holding the scissors. The sound of laughter drifted out from the clubhouse, a stark contrast to the quiet fury simmering in my chest. I thought about the life Carolyn and I had built together, the years of shared meals and quiet evenings, the way she used to smile at me across the table like I was the only person in the room. That smile was gone now, replaced by a smirk that made my stomach churn. She thought she'd won, thought she could take everything from me and leave me with nothing but memories. But she was wrong. I closed the notebook and slipped it back into my pocket, the weight of it grounding me. This wasn't just about the money or the betrayal. This was about taking back control, about proving to myself and to her that I wasn't the man she thought I was. The cards were on the table now, and I was done playing defense. As I walked back inside, the sunlight caught the edge of my coffee cup, casting a faint shadow across the table. I picked it up, the porcelain cool against my palm, and took a sip. The coffee was bitter just the way I liked it. Sometimes, bitterness is the only thing that keeps you awake. And I wasn't going to sleep until this was over. It was the candle that tipped me off. A stupid, flickering pillar of wax sitting on her nightstand. Carolyn had always hated candles, said they were a fire hazard, that they smelled like cheap motels. But there it was, burning night after night, filling the room with the scent of vanilla and something else I couldn't quite place. At first, I thought it was just another one of her whims, some midlife crisis-inspired phase. But then I noticed she'd sit by it, her face lit by the glow of her laptop, typing furiously, the light reflecting off her glasses like she was some kind of secret agent. I didn't snoop. Not at first. I'm not that guy. But when she started leaving her laptop open, when she stopped bothering to close tabs or clear her history, it felt like she was daring me. Like she wanted me to find something. And then there was the money. Small things at first, a missed credit card payment, a bounced check. She blamed it on bank errors, on glitches. But when I logged into our joint account one morning to pay the bills, the balance was lower than it should have been. Much lower. That's when I started digging. I'm not a tech guy, but I've got friends who are. One of the guys from the Bridge Club, a retired IT specialist, showed me how to track transactions, how to follow the digital breadcrumbs. It didn't take long to find the first transfer, $5,000 to an account I didn't recognize. Then another, and another, all going to the same place, all under the radar. Carolyn had always been the one who handled the finances. She was good with numbers, she said, organized, trustworthy. But now, staring at the screen, watching those numbers bleed out of our account, I felt like I was looking at a stranger. The password-protected file was the final nail. I found it buried in a folder labeled recipes. Recipes, like she thought I'd ever go looking for her damn zucchini bread instructions. It took me 3 days to crack it. 3 days of trying every combination of birthdays, anniversaries, and pet names I could think of. When it finally opened, I almost wished it hadn't. Spreadsheets, dozens of them, columns and rows of transactions, dates, amounts, transfers to accounts in her name, transfers to his name, hotel receipts, restaurant bills, even a charge for a couple's massage. Every dollar accounted for, every lie meticulously documented. I sat there for hours, scrolling through it all, the candle burning down to a nub beside me. The numbers didn't lie. She'd been planning this for months, maybe longer, and the whole time, she'd been sitting across from me at dinner, smiling, laughing, asking about my day. The anger came in waves. 1 minute I'd be calm, almost numb, scrolling through the evidence like it was someone else's life. The next, I'd be slamming my fist on the desk, cursing under my breath, wanting to throw the damn laptop out the window. But then I'd look at that candle, still burning, still filling the room with that sickly sweet smell, and I'd force myself to focus. This wasn't just about the money. It wasn't even about the affair as much as that stung. This was about control, about power. Carolyn had been playing a game, and she thought she was winning. But now I had the rules. and I wasn't going to lose. I printed everything. Every spreadsheet, every receipt, every transfer. I made copies, hid them in places she'd never think to look. And then I sat back, the candle finally flickering out, and stared at the screen. She thought she was clever, thought she'd covered her tracks. But she'd underestimated me, and that was her first mistake. I waited until the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like the world is holding its breath. The folders sat on the kitchen table, their edges crisp and sharp, like accusations waiting to cut. I'd spent weeks gathering everything: bank statements, transfer records, photos of hotel stays, even the receipts for the goddamn perfume she'd started wearing for him. The evidence was stacked neatly, a paper trail of betrayal that reeked of her lies. My hands were steady as I laid it all out, but my chest felt like it was full of broken glass. Carolyn walked in, humming some tune I didn't recognize. She froze when she saw me, her smile faltering for just a second before she plastered it back on. "Noah, what's all this?" she asked, her tone light, like she hadn't just walked into the wreckage of our marriage. I didn't answer right away. I let her eyes wander over the folders, the highlighted lines, the dates that didn't add up. I watched her face carefully, searching for the cracks. At first, she tried to laugh it off, her voice high and brittle. "What is this? Some kind of joke? Are you playing detective now?" I slid one of the folders toward her. "Open it." Her fingers hesitated, hovering over the edge like she was afraid it might burn her. When she finally flipped it open, I could see the color drain from her face. Her hand started to shake, and she dropped the folder like it was hot. Papers spilled across the table, the hotel receipts fanning out like a deck of cards. "Noah, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Let's talk about this." I leaned back in my chair, my jaw tight. "Talk about what, Carolyn? The money you've been funneling to your friend? The trips you lied about? Or maybe we should talk about how you've been laughing at me behind my back for months." She opened her mouth to protest, but I cut her off. Don't even try to spin this. I know everything. Every transfer. Every lie. Every time you looked me in the eye and told me you loved me while you were planning your next rendezvous. Her hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising. "I was lonely, Noah. You were always gone, always working, always with your bridge club. What was I supposed to do?" I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Lonely? That's your excuse? You think that justifies what you've done? You didn't just betray me, Carolyn. You betrayed our family. You betrayed Ethan. You made a fool out of all of us." She flinched at that, her eyes darting to the family photo hanging on the wall. For a moment, she looked like she might cry, but then her face hardened. "What are you going to do about it, Noah? You're retired. You don't have the energy for a fight." I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. "You're wrong," I said, my voice low and steady. "You've underestimated me for the last time." Her bravado faltered, and she took a step back, her heel catching on the edge of the rug. She stumbled, knocking into the side table, and the vase we'd bought on our honeymoon toppled to the floor. It shattered into 1,000 pieces, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. We both stared at the shards, the silence heavy between us. "You're going to regret this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my jaw clenched. "Maybe, but not as much as you will." And just like that, the power shifted. The woman who had once held all the cards was scrambling to pick them up, her hands trembling as she tried to salvage what was left of her facade. But it was too late. The truth was out, and there was no putting it back in the box. I left her standing there, surrounded by the wreckage of her own making, and walked out into the night. The air was cool, the stars sharp and bright overhead. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The courtroom was suffocating, the air thick with the weight of every word spoken. I sat on the worn wooden bench, my fingers gripping the edge so tightly I could feel the grain pressing into my skin. Carolyn sat across the room, her posture rigid, her face a mask of defiance. But I could see the cracks, the way her hands trembled ever so slightly, the way her eyes flicked toward the judge every few seconds, searching for a lifeline that wasn't coming. The judge's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "In light of the evidence presented, I am granting Mr. Noah Carter full control of all marital assets. Mrs. Carolyn Carter's actions have demonstrated a clear pattern of financial misconduct and deceit. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and the sound echoed in my chest. I didn't cheer. I didn't even smile. I just sat there, staring at the back of Carolyn's head, watching as her shoulders sagged under the weight of the verdict. The murmurs from the crowd swelled around us. Friends, family, strangers, all here to witness the unraveling of a life we'd built together. For a moment, I thought she might turn around, might look at me one last time with those eyes that had once held so much warmth. But she didn't. She kept her gaze fixed on the floor, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. The woman I'd loved for 30 years, the woman who'd stood beside me at the altar and promised forever, was now a stranger. And in that moment, I felt nothing but a hollow kind of relief. As the bailiff escorted her out of the courtroom, the crowd parted like the Red Sea, their whispers following her like a shadow. Did you hear what she did? I can't believe she'd stoop that low. Poor Noah, after all he's done for her. Their pitying glances stung more than Carolyn's betrayal ever had. I didn't want their sympathy. I didn't want to be the cautionary tale they talk about over Sunday dinners. I just wanted to be free. My lawyer clapped me on the shoulder, his voice low and triumphant. You did it, Noah. She can't touch you now. I nodded, but the words felt empty. This wasn't a victory. It was a reckoning. Outside, the sun was blinding, but it didn't warm me. I stood on the courthouse steps, the gavel's echo still ringing in my ears, and watched as Carolyn climbed into a waiting car. She didn't look back, not once. And as the car pulled away, disappearing into the midday traffic, I felt something I hadn't expected: grief. Not for her, but for the life we'd lost, for the dreams we'd buried under years of lies. The crowd around me began to disperse, their murmurs fading into the hum of the city. I slipped my hand into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of my wedding ring. I hadn't worn it in months, but I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. Not yet. As I walked to my car, the weight of the judge's ruling settled over me like a heavy coat. I had won. I had my money, my freedom, my dignity. But as I slid behind the wheel and stared at the empty passenger seat, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd lost something far more important. The drive home was quiet, the radio turned off, the road stretching out before me like a blank page. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know how to rebuild a life from the ashes of what we'd destroyed. But for the first time in years, I felt like I had a choice. And that was enough. For now, it was enough. The moving truck idled in the driveway, its engine a low growl that matched the tension in the air. Carolyn stood by the open door, her arms crossed, her face a mask of something I couldn't quite place. Defiance? Maybe, or regret, or nothing at all. The movers were loading the last of her things, the boxes stacked neatly, each one a piece of our life together now being carted away. I stood in the doorway watching, feeling like a ghost in my own home. The faded family portrait on the wall caught my eye, the one we'd taken years ago at Ethan's high school graduation. Carolyn had insisted on it, her smile wide, her arm around me like I was her greatest treasure. Now that same portrait felt like a cruel joke. The colors had dulled over time, just like the life we'd built together. I reached up and took it off the wall, the glass cool against my fingers. For a moment, I thought about smashing it, about letting the shards scatter across the floor like the broken pieces of us. But I didn't. I just set it down on the table, face down like I was burying it. Carolyn turned to me, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You don't have to stand there like some kind of martyr," she said, her voice sharp but brittle, like it might crack under the weight of her own words. "This isn't all on me." I didn't respond. What was there to say? That she was wrong? That this was all on her? Maybe it wasn't. Maybe I'd been too blind, too trusting, too willing to believe the lie we'd been living. But standing there, watching her pack up the life we'd shared, I couldn't find the energy to fight. The anger was there, simmering just beneath the surface, but it felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. The movers closed the back of the truck with a loud clang, and Carolyn glanced over her shoulder, her posture stiffening. "Well," she said, her voice softer now, almost hesitant. "I guess that's it." I nodded, my throat tight. "Yeah, I guess it is." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Something that might have been sadness or maybe just exhaustion. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by that same hollow emptiness that had been there since the truth came out. She turned and walked to the car without another word, her heels clicking against the pavement like a clock ticking down the final seconds of our marriage. I watched her go, the car pulling out of the driveway and disappearing down the street. The emptiness of the driveway mirrored the emptiness inside me, a void where 30 years of my life had once been. I stepped outside, the chill of the autumn air biting at my skin, and stared at the space where her car had been. The house felt too quiet now, the silence pressing in on me like a weight. Back inside, I wandered through the rooms, each one a testament to the life we'd built and the life we'd lost. The living room, where we'd spent countless evenings watching TV and pretending everything was fine. The kitchen, where we'd shared meals and conversations that now felt like rehearsed lines in a play. The bedroom, where the bed was still unmade from the morning, the sheets tangled and cold. I sat down on the edge of the mattress, my hands resting on my knees, and let the quiet swallow me whole. It wasn't just Carolyn I'd lost. It was the future I'd imagined, the one where we grew old together, where we sat on the porch in rocking chairs and watched the grandkids play in the yard. That future was gone now, replaced by a blank space I didn't know how to fill. And as I sat there, staring at the empty room, I realized I wasn't just saying goodbye to Carolyn. I was saying goodbye to the man I'd been, the man who'd believed in her, in us, in the life we'd built. The sun was setting by the time I got up, the light fading into a deep, bruised purple. I walked back to the living room and picked up the family portrait, turning it over in my hands. The faces stared back at me, frozen in time, a snapshot of a moment that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. I carried it to the closet and tucked it away on the top shelf, out of sight but not out of mind. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in after a storm, when the air feels heavy and still. I stood in the doorway, looking out at the empty driveway, and took a deep breath. This wasn't the end, I told myself. It was just a new beginning, even if it didn't feel like one yet. But as the last of the daylight faded, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of something vast and unknown, and I had no idea what came next. The porch swing creaked softly as I rocked back and forth, the rhythm steady and soothing, like the metronome Carolyn used to keep on the piano. The sun hung low in the sky, painting the horizon in streaks of orange and purple, the kind of sunset that made you feel small in the best way. My hands rested on my knees, calloused from years of work, now idle for the first time in decades. The house behind me was quiet, still unfamiliar in its emptiness, but the air smelled like fresh-cut grass and the faint tang of charcoal from the grill where my bridge club buddies were finishing up dinner. They were out there now, laughing and bickering over who had botched the last hand. Frank, with his ever-present cigar stub, was waving his arms like a madman, recounting some improbable play he'd made. Martha, sharp as a tack and twice as blunt, was doling out her usual brand of tough love. And then there was Ed, my oldest friend, who'd been the first to show up with a six-pack and a sympathetic ear when everything had gone to hell. They'd been there through it all, the whispers at the club, the awkward silences when Carolyn's name came up, the nights I'd sat in my study with a whiskey and a mountain of anger I couldn't quite swallow. Now, though the anger had dulled, it wasn't gone, not entirely, but it didn't feel like a knife in my chest anymore. It was more like a scar, tender if you pressed too hard but otherwise just a reminder of what I'd survived. Carolyn was gone, her things packed into boxes and her name scrubbed from the accounts, but the life she tried to take from me was still here, still mine. I took a sip of the iced tea Martha had brought over, the glass sweating in my hand. It was strange, sitting here without the weight of her betrayal pressing down on me. For so long, I'd been defined by her, by the marriage, the lies, the fight to claw back what was mine. Now, though, I was just Noah again. Just a guy with a porch swing and a sunset and a group of friends who'd stuck by me when I wasn't sure I deserved it. Frank wandered over, his cigar trailing a thin ribbon of smoke. "You gonna sit there all night, or you gonna come help us clean up?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Give me a minute," I said, nodding toward the sunset. "I'm enjoying the view," he grunted, leaning against the porch railing. "You earned it," he said after a moment. "Hell of a thing what you went through, but you came out the other side. Not everyone does." I didn't say anything, just rocked a little harder, the swing's chains groaning in protest. He was right, though. I had come out the other side. The house was mine, the accounts were mine, and for the first time in a long time my life felt like mine too. Carolyn had tried to take everything, but she'd underestimated me. She'd underestimated the friends who'd rallied around me, the son who'd stood by me, and the quiet, stubborn strength I hadn't known I had until I'd needed it. The sun dipped lower, its light softening as the stars began to peek through. Inside, the laughter grew louder, and I could hear Martha scolding someone about leaving crumbs on the counter. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was mine, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. I stood, the swing rocking gently behind me, and headed inside to join my friends. The sunset would wait, and so would the rest of my life. For now I was right where I needed to be.